My name is Eleanor Whitman. I was feeding chickens at 6:34 a.m. when I heard infant crying, faint but distinct, coming from the creek approximately 200 yards south. At 62 with crow-trained ears, I could distinguish human sounds from animal calls. I dropped my bucket to investigate, but my chest tightened suddenly. My breathing shortened. I clutched my ribs to ease pressure, though the pain spread rapidly. I gasped for air. My vision darkened. I stumbled forward. My heart pounded irregularly. I tried calling for help, but my voice failed entirely. I collapsed near the barn. Have you ever known something terrible was happening but struggled to make others believe you? Would you have grabbed a shovel and dug yourself or wasted time arguing with doubters? But let me take you back to where this nightmare truly began. The morning the ravens started screaming their warnings. The ravens were screaming. That's what woke me before dawn on the morning everything changed. In Crow tradition, ravens bring messages from the spirit world, warnings that wise women ignore at their peril. I sat up in my narrow bed, listening to their harsh cries echoing across our Montana ranch, and felt ice settle in my bones despite the September warmth. At 62, I'd learned to trust these omens. My crow mother had taught me to read the signs before she died of the white man's fever when I was barely 16. "Listen with more than your ears, little sparrow," she'd whispered in our native tongue. "The spirits speak to those who have eyes to see." I pulled on my worn buckskin dress, the one Thomas always frowned at, saying it made the neighbors uncomfortable, and stepped onto the porch of the small cabin I'd built behind the main house. The crazy mountains loomed like sleeping giants in the pre-dawn darkness, and somewhere in that wilderness, my ancestors' spirits still wandered. The coffee I brewed over the fire tasted bitter as sage, matching my mood. Through the thin walls, I could hear movement in Thomas's cabin, my son preparing for another day of ranch work, unaware that his 32 years of life were about to be cut short by the woman sleeping beside him. But I didn't know that yet. I only knew something was wrong. Victoria emerged from the main cabin as the sun crested the mountains, her golden hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour. My daughter-in-law had been raised in Philadelphia society, where appearances mattered more than substance. Even here in the wilderness, she maintained that Eastern elegance that had first captivated my son 3 years ago. "Good morning, Eleanor," she called, her voice carrying that refined accent that never quite fit our rough frontier life. But there was something else in her tone today, a tension that made my crow instincts sharpen like a blade. I watched her saddle her mare with practiced efficiency. Victoria had adapted to ranch life better than I'd expected, learning to rope and brand cattle with surprising skill. Yet she'd never truly accepted my heritage, never shown genuine interest in the crow traditions I'd tried to share. She was polite but distant, like someone tolerating an unpleasant relative. "Thomas rode out early to check the north fence," she continued, avoiding my eyes. "I have personal business to attend to today. I may be quite late returning." The way she said personal business sent a chill down my spine. In my experience, people only used such vague terms when they were hiding something dangerous. "What kind of business?" I asked, though I already knew she wouldn't answer truthfully. "Nothing that concerns you." Her green eyes flashed with something cold and calculating. "Don't wait supper for me." As I watched her ride toward the creek that bordered our property, carrying a heavy bundle tied behind her saddle, every instinct my mother had given me screamed danger. The ravens had fallen silent, which somehow felt worse than their earlier warnings. I should have followed her, should have trusted the ancient wisdom flowing through my mixed blood, should have remembered that evil often wears a beautiful face. Instead, I stood there like a fool, watching my son's wife disappear into the cottonwoods with murder in her heart and my grandson's life in her hands. I had the blood of warriors in my veins, yet I let politeness override my survival instincts. When you sense someone close to you is capable of unspeakable evil, do you act on suspicion alone? Or do you stay silent and become an accomplice to the darkness you failed to stop? The moon was dark when Victoria returned. I hadn't slept. Couldn't sleep with those raven warnings still echoing in my bones. Instead, I sat by my cabin window, wrapped in my grandmother's buffalo robe, watching the creek where the cottonwoods cast twisted shadows in the starlight. Thomas had come home hours ago, exhausted from mending fence, and fallen into bed without asking where his wife had been all day. My son trusted too easily. It was both his greatest strength and, I feared, his fatal weakness. Near midnight, I heard hoofbeats approaching from the south. Victoria's mare picked her way carefully through the darkness, and even from a distance I could see my daughter-in-law's rigid posture in the saddle. She was carrying something, the same heavy bundle she'd taken that morning, but now it seemed different somehow. Smaller, heavier, with a weight that had nothing to do with size. She dismounted near the creek, perhaps 50 yards from my window, clearly believing herself unobserved. The bundle was wrapped in what looked like Thomas's old winter coat tied with rope. Victoria struggled with its weight as she carried it toward the water's edge, and I noticed she'd brought a shovel. Every crow instinct I possessed screamed danger. I slipped from my cabin like smoke, my moccasins silent on the frost-hardened ground. My mixed blood had given me advantages in this wilderness. I could move through shadows like my mother's people, unseen and unheard when necessary. The spirits of my ancestors seemed to guide my steps as I crept closer to where Victoria knelt by the creek. She was digging frantically, her refined eastern hands blistered and bleeding from the unfamiliar work. The hole she carved in the soft creek bank was small but deep, just large enough for the bundle she'd brought. In the starlight, I could see tears streaming down her face, not tears of grief, but of desperation and fear. "Please forgive me," she whispered to the bundle as she lowered it into the makeshift grave. "I had no choice. I couldn't let you ruin everything." The words turned my blood to ice water. Whatever was in that bundle had been alive when she'd taken it from our ranch that morning. Victoria covered the hole quickly, packing earth and stones over whatever she'd buried, then scattered dead leaves to hide her work. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the unmarked grave, before mounting her mare and riding back toward the house. I waited until her footsteps faded before approaching the burial site. The ground was still soft, disturbed. My hands shook as I began to dig, using a sharp stone when the earth became too hard for my fingers. The crow, part of me whispered that some secrets were better left buried, but the grandmother in me, though I didn't yet know that's what I was, demanded the truth. The bundle was lighter than I'd expected, wrapped in Thomas's coat and tied with kitchen twine. My heart hammered against my ribs as I loosened the knots with trembling fingers. The fabric fell away, and I found myself staring at a sight that stopped my breath entirely. A baby, a newborn child, pale and still, wrapped in a blood-stained nightgown I recognized as Victoria's. His tiny face was blue-white in the starlight, his lips the color of winter sky. He wasn't breathing, but when I pressed my ear to his chest, I heard it, the faintest flutter of a heartbeat, weak but persistent. He was alive. Barely, impossibly alive. I gathered him against my chest, feeling his cold skin through the thin fabric, and ran toward my cabin faster than these old legs had carried me in years. Behind me, the creek whispered secrets to the darkness, and somewhere in the main house, Victoria was probably washing grave dirt from her hands while my son slept beside her, never knowing she'd just tried to murder his child. I held a dying baby in my arms while his mother slept peacefully 50 yards away. Should I have confronted Victoria immediately, or was I right to focus on saving the child first? When you catch someone in an act of pure evil, what's your moral obligation? Justice or mercy? Dawn was breaking as I burst through Dr. Margaret Stone's door, the half-frozen baby clutched against my chest like a prayer made flesh. "Margaret!" I shouted, not caring that I was waking half the territory. "Dear God, Margaret, help me!" Dr. Stone appeared in her nightgown, her graying hair loose around her shoulders, but her hands were already reaching for the child before she was fully awake. She was the only trained physician within 50 miles, a woman who'd come west after losing her husband in the war, and had saved more lives in this wilderness than most men twice her size. "What happened?" she demanded, taking the baby to her examination table while lighting every lamp in her small clinic. "This child is nearly frozen. How long has he been exposed?" "Hours," I gasped, unwilling to say more until I understood what we were dealing with. "Maybe longer. I found him by the creek." Her skilled hands worked over the tiny body, checking for breath, heartbeat, signs of life. The baby was so still, so pale, that for terrible moments I thought we were too late. But Margaret's face showed the focused calm of someone who'd delivered babies in blizzards and sewn up gunshot wounds by candlelight. "He's alive," she said finally, wrapping him in warm blankets she'd heated by the fire. "Barely, but alive. This child was born recently, within the last day or two." "Where's his mother?" The question I'd been dreading. I looked into Margaret's sharp brown eyes and saw the intelligence that had made her one of the most respected people in our territory. She would want the truth, and she deserved it. But the truth would destroy my son's marriage, and possibly his life. "I don't know," I said, which was both a lie and the truth. I knew who had given birth to this child, but I didn't know the woman who could bury her own baby alive. Margaret's expression told me she didn't believe my evasion, but she was too skilled a doctor to press the issue while a life hung in the balance. "I need to get his body temperature up slowly. Too fast, and we could kill him. And Eleanor," she paused, studying my face, "this baby needs more help than I can give him alone. We need supplies, warm milk, someone to help watch him around the clock." Word spread through our small community like wildfire on dry grass. By mid-morning, my cabin was filled with neighbor women, each bringing what they could: soft blankets, goat's milk, herbs for strengthening tea. Samuel Hayes arrived with his wife Martha, both of them grim-faced but ready to help. Even young Jimmy from our bunkhouse appeared with an armload of firewood and questions in his eyes. "Whose baby is this, Eleanor?" Samuel asked quietly while the women fussed over the child. He was a good man, a fellow rancher who'd helped us through hard times, but he was also sharp enough to know something wasn't right about this situation. "A child who needed help," I replied, watching as the baby's color slowly improved under Margaret's care. "That's all that matters right now." But Samuel's weathered face showed he wasn't satisfied with that answer. "Found by the creek, you said? In this weather? Eleanor, babies don't just appear in the wilderness. Someone left this child to die." The words hung in the air like smoke from a green fire. Around us, the neighbor women continued their work, but I could feel their attention sharpening, their curiosity becoming suspicion. These were frontier people, practical folks who'd seen enough hardship to recognize deliberate cruelty when it stared them in the face. "We need to notify the territorial marshal," Martha Hayes said quietly. "If someone tried to kill this baby—" "No." The word came out harder than I intended. "Not yet. Let's focus on keeping him alive first. Everything else can wait." But even as I said it, I knew I was only buying time. In a community this small, secrets had a way of surfacing like bodies in a river. And somewhere in the main house, Victoria was probably wondering why so many neighbors had gathered at dawn, and whether her buried secret was still safely hidden. I was protecting a woman who'd tried to murder her own child, all to save my son from heartbreak. When keeping family secrets means enabling evil, where do you draw the line? Is loyalty to blood worth becoming an accomplice to attempted murder? By the third day, I could no longer bear the weight of what I knew. The baby was growing stronger under Dr. Stone's care and the community's watchful eyes. But the questions were growing stronger too. Samuel Hayes had started making pointed comments about notifying the territorial authorities. Martha kept asking whose child this could be. Her eyes, too. Knowing when she looked at me. And Victoria. Victoria moved through it all like a woman sleepwalking, helping tend the baby she'd tried to murder, her face a mask of concern that fooled everyone but me. I needed guidance from someone who understood both justice and mercy, someone who could help me see through the spiritual fog that clouded my judgment. There was only one person I trusted with secrets this dark. I rode to the Crow Reservation at dawn, my mare picking her way along the familiar trail that led to Running Bear's Lodge. The old medicine man had been my mother's cousin, one of the few who'd accepted my mixed heritage without judgment. When I'd married Thomas's father, Running Bear had blessed our union with both Crow and Christian prayers, understanding that love could bridge any divide. I found him sitting outside his lodge, working strips of hide with patient hands, as if he'd been expecting me. At 78, Running Bear moved slowly, but his dark eyes were still sharp as obsidian, missing nothing. "Little Sparrow," he said in Crow, using the childhood name my mother had given me. "You carry a heavy burden. The spirits have been whispering of trouble at your ranch." I dismounted and sat beside him on the worn buffalo robe he'd spread on the ground. "Uncle," I said, using the respectful term for an elder, "I need your wisdom. A child's life hangs in the balance, and I don't know what path to walk." Running Bear set aside his work and studied my face with the intensity of someone reading tracks in difficult terrain. "Tell me everything, child. Hold nothing back. The spirits cannot guide us if we hide truth behind fear." So I told him. Everything. Victoria's midnight burial, the baby barely alive in the grave, my decision to protect Thomas by hiding his wife's crime. Running Bear listened without interruption, his weathered face growing more grave with each revelation. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring at the sacred mountains where our ancestors' spirits dwelled. Finally, he reached into his medicine bag and withdrew a handful of sage and sweetgrass. "We will ask the spirits to show us the truth," he said, lighting the herbs in his fire. "But first, you must be prepared to see what they reveal. Truth is like winter wind. It cuts through everything, even what we wish to keep hidden." The smoke rose between us, carrying our prayers to the spirit world. Running Bear began to chant in the old language, words that spoke of justice and protection, of children who needed defending, and mothers who had lost their way. As the sacred smoke swirled around us, I felt something shift in my understanding, like pieces of a broken pot suddenly showing their true pattern. "The child," Running Bear said suddenly, his eyes still closed. "He carries the blood of your blood. The spirits show me a young man with your son's face, but grown to manhood. This baby is your grandson, Little Sparrow." The words hit me like lightning. My grandson. Thomas had fathered this child, which meant... "Victoria was with child when she tried to kill him," I whispered, understanding flooding through me like ice water. "But why would she murder her own baby?" Running Bear's eyes opened, and in them I saw a sadness deeper than winter lakes. "Because she had already murdered the father. The spirits show me your son's death was no accident, child. His woman killed him for the white man's money, and she tried to kill his son for the same reason." The sacred fire seemed to dim as the full horror of it settled over me. Thomas was dead, murdered by the woman he'd loved and trusted, and she'd carried his child for months, planning all along to kill them both. "What does tribal law say about such evil?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "That justice must be swift and complete," Running Bear replied, "but you live in the white man's world now, where their laws move slowly, and evidence must be gathered like winter wood. The choice is yours, Little Sparrow. Tribal justice or territorial law." I had to choose between my people's swift justice and the white man's slow courts. Victoria had murdered my son and tried to kill my grandson. Which justice system would you trust with such evil? When the law fails, do we have the right to take justice into our own hands? Armed with Running Bear's spiritual confirmation, I rode back to the ranch with the fury of my ancestors burning in my veins. Thomas had been murdered, and his killer was sleeping in his bed, tending his child with blood-stained hands while the whole community praised her motherly devotion. But spiritual truth wouldn't be enough for territorial law. I needed evidence the white man's courts would accept. I waited until Victoria rode out to check the cattle, her daily ritual of maintaining innocence, before searching Thomas's cabin. My hands shook as I went through his personal belongings, looking for anything that might explain why she'd killed him. In a wooden box beneath his bed, I found what I was seeking: Thomas's will, written in his careful hand just 2 weeks before his death. The document was simple but devastating. Thomas had left everything: the ranch, the cattle, his savings, to any children born of my marriage to Victoria Hayes Whitman. Not to Victoria herself, but to his children. My son had suspected something was wrong with his wife, and he'd protected his unborn child the only way he knew how. But there was more. Folded inside the will was a letter addressed to me, dated the day before Thomas died. "Mother, if something happens to me, know that I fear for my child's safety. Victoria has been asking strange questions about my will, about what would happen if I died. She's been meeting with strangers in town, men I don't recognize. I've changed my will to protect the baby, but I'm afraid it won't be enough. If you're reading this, please watch over my child. Don't let Victoria—" The letter ended there, unfinished. Thomas had run out of time to warn me properly, but he'd tried. My son had died knowing his wife meant to kill him, and he'd spent his last days trying to protect a child he'd never lived to hold. I was still staring at the letter when Sheriff Morrison appeared in the doorway, his weathered face grim. James Morrison was a good man, a Civil War veteran who'd brought real law to our territory, but he was also cautious, too cautious for the justice my grandson needed. "Eleanor," he said, removing his hat respectfully, "Samuel Hayes sent word about the baby. Says you found him by the creek, near dead from cold." "That's right." I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my dress pocket. "Someone tried to kill that child, Sheriff. Any idea who might do such a thing?" His pale blue eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "Baby that young had to come from somewhere close. Someone in our community gave birth recently and kept it secret." I looked at this man who represented territorial justice, slow, methodical, requiring evidence and witnesses and legal procedures that could take months while Victoria walked free. In Crow law, we would have confronted her immediately, demanded she face the consequences of her evil. But I lived in both worlds now, and I had to choose carefully. "I have suspicions," I said finally, "but I need to gather more evidence before I make accusations." Morrison nodded, but his expression told me he wasn't entirely satisfied. "Eleanor, if you know something about this child's parentage, you need to tell me. Attempted murder is a hanging offense, even in territorial court." After he left, I sat in Thomas's cabin holding my son's final letter and feeling the weight of impossible choices. The baby was growing stronger each day, but Victoria was growing more confident too, playing the role of concerned neighbor while secretly knowing she'd failed to kill her own child. That evening, as I fed little Wolf, I'd started thinking of him by the crow name Running Bear had whispered during our ceremony, Victoria appeared at my cabin door. "Eleanor," she said, her voice honey-sweet with false concern, "I've been thinking about that poor baby. Since no one has claimed him, perhaps James and I should take him in. We have more room, more resources. It would be the Christian thing to do." The audacity of it stole my breath. She wanted to adopt the child she'd tried to murder, probably to finish what she'd started, once the community's attention moved elsewhere. "That's very generous," I managed to say, "but I've grown attached to him. I think I'll keep him." Something flickered behind Victoria's green eyes. Surprise, then calculation, then what might have been fear. "Of course," she said smoothly, "but if you change your mind—" After she left, I barred my door and loaded Thomas's rifle, because I'd seen something in Victoria's face that told me she'd realized her mistake in letting the baby live, and she was already planning to correct it. She wanted to adopt the baby she'd tried to murder, to finish the job properly this time. I could expose her immediately and risk a legal battle I might lose, or wait for more evidence while my grandson remained in danger. When you know someone is evil but can't prove it, do you act on certainty or wait for justice? I couldn't fight Victoria alone, not when she'd already proven capable of murder and was planning to strike again. That night, I sent word through the territory's informal network of neighbors and friends. "Meet at the schoolhouse at dawn. Urgent matter concerning the baby's safety." They came. Samuel and Martha Hayes, Dr. Margaret Stone, young Jimmy from our bunkhouse, even old Pete, who rarely left his claim except for supplies. Most surprising of all, Running Bear arrived with 2 other Crow men, their faces painted for war council. In the frontier, when someone called for help, you answered. No questions asked until everyone was gathered. I stood before this unlikely assembly as the sun rose over the crazy mountains, holding Thomas's final letter in hands that no longer trembled. These people had become my family over the years, bound together by the harsh demands of frontier life. Now I needed them to help me save my grandson's life. "Friends," I began, my voice carrying clearly in the crisp morning air, I asked you here because a child's life hangs in the balance, and I can't protect him alone." I told them everything: Victoria's midnight burial, the baby's near death, Thomas's will and final letter, Running Bear's spiritual confirmation that the child was my grandson. I watched their faces change as the full horror of it settled over them: shock, disgust, and finally a cold anger that matched my own. "You're saying Victoria murdered Thomas?" Samuel's voice was tight with controlled fury. "And tried to kill her own baby?" "For money," I confirmed, showing them the will. "Thomas left everything to his children, not to her. She killed him thinking she'd inherit, then discovered the baby would get everything if he lived." Dr. Stone's face had gone pale. "I delivered babies for women who kept their pregnancies secret before, but I never suspected. She must have given birth alone, then tried to dispose of the evidence. The question now," Sheriff Morrison said, he'd arrived quietly during my explanation, "is what we do about it. We have strong evidence, but Victoria's already suspicious. If she realizes we know the truth, she'll run," Martha finished. "Or worse, she'll try again to kill the baby." Running Bear spoke for the first time, his English careful but clear. "In Crow law, when someone murders family, the whole tribe seeks justice. This woman killed Little Sparrow's son and tried to kill her grandson. She has made herself enemy to all of us." The old medicine man's words seemed to crystallize something in the group. These weren't just neighbors anymore. They were a tribe, bound by shared outrage and determination to protect an innocent child. "She's been acting strange lately," Jimmy offered, "asking questions about the trail south, where a person might go to disappear. Yesterday I saw her packing supplies like she was planning a long journey." "Then we don't have much time," Sheriff Morrison said grimly. "If she's planning to run, she'll want to eliminate the witness first." He looked at me. "Eleanor, you and the baby need protection, and we need to find Victoria before she can strike again." Samuel stood, his weathered rancher's hands clenched into fists. "I say we form a proper posse. Search every inch of this territory until we find her." "Agreed," Dr. Stone said firmly, "but we do this right. No vigilante justice. We capture her alive and let territorial law handle the punishment." Running Bear's dark eyes met mine across the circle. In them, I saw the patient wisdom of my people, but also something harder, the promise that if territorial law failed, Crow justice would not. "We'll split into search teams," Morrison decided. "Cover all the likely escape routes. Samuel, take the south trails. Jimmy and Pete, check the old mining camps." "Running Bear, your people know this country better than anyone." "We will watch the sacred places," the medicine man interrupted. "Places where white law cannot follow, but Crow justice can." As the meeting broke up and people began preparing for the search, Martha Hayes approached me with little Wolf in her arms. The baby was awake, his dark eyes, so like Thomas's, looking up at her with innocent trust. "Eleanor," she said quietly, "whatever happens out there, know that this child will never be alone. We're all his family now." Looking around at these determined faces, white and Crow, young and old, all united in protecting my grandson, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Thomas's death: hope. We were about to hunt down a murderer with a mixed posse of settlers and Crow warriors. Some would call it justice. Others would call it a lynch mob. When the legal system moves too slowly to protect the innocent, does a community have the right to take action? Where's the line between justice and vengeance? We found Victoria at the abandoned Copper Creek mining camp, just as Jimmy had predicted. Running Bear's tracking skills had led us there. Broken twigs, disturbed earth, the faint scent of her horse's distinctive gait that only Crow eyes could follow. She'd chosen her hiding place well, a played-out mine shaft where desperate men had once clawed gold from the mountain's bones, now empty except for rotting timber and broken dreams. But she hadn't counted on facing the combined wisdom of two peoples united in righteous anger. I crouched behind a boulder with Sheriff Morrison, watching Victoria through the gray dawn light as she loaded supplies onto her mare. She moved with the frantic energy of someone who knew her time was running out, constantly glancing over her shoulder as if she could feel our eyes upon her. "She's got a rifle," Morrison whispered, pointing to the Winchester strapped to her saddle. "And she's desperate. Desperate people do unpredictable things." Around us, the posse had taken positions with military precision. Samuel Hayes covered the narrow trail that led back toward town. Running Bear and his warriors had positioned themselves on the high rocks, cutting off any escape into the wilderness. Dr. Stone waited with the horses, ready to tend wounds if this went badly. "Victoria!" I called out, standing slowly with my hands visible. "There's nowhere left to run." She spun toward my voice, her face a mask of fury and fear. The refined Eastern lady was gone, replaced by something wild and cornered. Her golden hair hung in tangles, her dress was torn and stained with dirt, and her green eyes held the desperate gleam of a rabid animal. "Eleanor!" she snarled. "I should have known you'd be the one to ruin everything. You and your savage superstitions, always filling Thomas's head with nonsense about family and honor." "Thomas knew what you were," I said, stepping closer despite Morrison's warning gesture. "He changed his will to protect his son from you. He died knowing you meant to kill him." Victoria's laugh was like breaking glass. "Thomas was a fool who thought love conquered all. But love doesn't pay debts or buy passage to San Francisco. Love doesn't give you the life you deserve. So you murdered him for money." Samuel's voice carried from the rocks above. "And tried to kill your own child." "That baby was never my child," Victoria screamed, her composure finally cracking completely. "It was a chain around my neck, a burden that would have trapped me in this God-forsaken wilderness forever. I gave it life, and I had every right to take that life away." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Around us, I could feel the posse's anger crystallizing into something harder and more dangerous. In Crow tradition, a woman who killed her own child had committed the ultimate abomination, an act that demanded the harshest justice. "Drop the rifle, Victoria," Sheriff Morrison called out, stepping into view with his badge gleaming in the morning light. "You're under arrest for the murder of Thomas Whitman and the attempted murder of his child." For a moment, I thought she might surrender. Her shoulders sagged, and the rifle wavered in her hands. But then her eyes found mine, and I saw the calculation there. The same cold intelligence that had planned Thomas's death so carefully. "If I can't have the money," she said, raising the Winchester toward me, "then no one gets to be happy." The shot echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, but it wasn't Victoria's rifle that fired. Running Bear's arrow took her in the shoulder, spinning her around and sending her weapon clattering across the rocky ground. Before she could recover, Samuel and Jimmy were on her, pinning her face down in the dirt while Morrison secured her hands with iron shackles. "Crow justice is swift," Running Bear said quietly, lowering his bow. "But white law requires she live to face judgment." Victoria writhed in the dirt, screaming curses and threats, but her power was broken. The woman who had murdered my son and tried to kill my grandson was finally in chains, and the weight I'd carried for days began to lift from my shoulders. "It's over," Morrison said, hauling Victoria to her feet. "She'll stand trial in the territorial court, and with the evidence we have, she'll hang." Looking at this broken woman who had brought such evil into our lives, I felt no satisfaction, only a deep weariness and the knowledge that justice, while necessary, could never bring Thomas back. We captured a child killer through frontier justice, part legal posse, part tribal vengeance. She'll hang legally now, but was our mixed law approach right? When evil is this pure, do traditional legal boundaries matter, or does justice require whatever methods work? We found Victoria at the abandoned Copper Creek mining camp, just as Jimmy had predicted. Running Bear's tracking skills had led us there. Broken twigs, disturbed earth, the faint scent of her horse's distinctive gait that only Crow eyes could follow. She'd chosen her hiding place well, a played-out mine shaft where desperate men had once clawed gold from the mountain's bones, now empty except for rotting timber and broken dreams. but she hadn't counted on facing the combined wisdom of two peoples united in righteous anger. I crouched behind a boulder with Sheriff Morrison, watching Victoria through the gray dawn light as she loaded supplies onto her mare. She moved with the frantic energy of someone who knew her time was running out, constantly glancing over her shoulder as if she could feel our eyes upon her. "She's got a rifle," Morrison whispered, pointing to the Winchester strapped to her saddle. "And she's desperate. Desperate people do unpredictable things." Around us, the posse had taken positions with military precision. Samuel Hayes covered the narrow trail that led back toward town. Running Bear and his warriors had positioned themselves on the high rocks, cutting off any escape into the wilderness. Dr. Stone waited with the horses, ready to tend wounds if this went badly. "Victoria," I called out, standing slowly with my hands visible, "there's nowhere left to run." She spun toward my voice, her face a mask of fury and fear. The refined Eastern lady was gone, replaced by something wild and cornered. Her golden hair hung in tangles, her dress was torn and stained with dirt, and her green eyes held the desperate gleam of a rabid animal. "Eleanor," she snarled, "I should have known you'd be the one to ruin everything. You and your savage superstitions, always filling Thomas's head with nonsense about family and honor. Thomas knew what you were," I said, stepping closer despite Morrison's warning gesture. "He changed his will to protect his son from you. He died knowing you meant to kill him." Victoria's laugh was like breaking glass. "Thomas was a fool who thought love conquered all. But love doesn't pay debts or buy passage to San Francisco. Love doesn't give you the life you deserve. So you murdered him for money," Samuel's voice carried from the rocks above, "and tried to kill your own child." "That baby was never my child," Victoria screamed, her composure finally cracking completely. "It was a chain around my neck, a burden that would have trapped me in this godforsaken wilderness forever. I gave it life, and I had every right to take that life away." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Around us, I could feel the posse's anger crystallizing into something harder and more dangerous. In Crow tradition, a woman who killed her own child had committed the ultimate abomination, an act that demanded the harshest justice. "Drop the rifle, Victoria," Sheriff Morrison called out, stepping into view with his badge gleaming in the morning light. "You're under arrest for the murder of Thomas Whitman and the attempted murder of his child." For a moment, I thought she might surrender. Her shoulders sagged, and the rifle wavered in her hands. But then her eyes found mine, and I saw the calculation there. The same cold intelligence that had planned Thomas's death so carefully. "If I can't have the money," she said, raising the Winchester toward me, "then no one gets to be happy." The shot echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, but it wasn't Victoria's rifle that fired. Running Bear's arrow took her in the shoulder, spinning her around and sending her weapon clattering across the rocky ground. Before she could recover, Samuel and Jimmy were on her, pinning her face down in the dirt while Morrison secured her hands with iron shackles. "Crow justice is swift," Running Bear said quietly, lowering his bow. "But white law requires she live to face judgment." Victoria writhed in the dirt, screaming curses and threats, but her power was broken. The woman who had murdered my son and tried to kill my grandson was finally in chains, and the weight I'd carried for days began to lift from my shoulders. "It's over," Morrison said, hauling Victoria to her feet. "She'll stand trial in the territorial court, and with the evidence we have, she'll hang." Looking at this broken woman who had brought such evil into our lives, I felt no satisfaction, only a deep weariness and the knowledge that justice, while necessary, could never bring Thomas back. We captured a child killer through frontier justice, part legal posse, part tribal vengeance. She'll hang legally now, but was our mixed law approach right? When evil is this pure, do traditional legal boundaries matter, or does justice require whatever methods work? 2 years had passed since Victoria's execution, and Tommy was growing into a sturdy frontier boy with his father's gentle eyes, and what I suspected was his grandmother's stubborn streak. I watched him from the porch as he played in the dirt with wooden horses Samuel Hayes had carved for him, chattering away in the mixture of English and Crow words I'd been teaching him. At 3 years old, he was already showing signs of the cultural bridge he would need to become, comfortable with both the practical demands of ranch life and the spiritual wisdom of my mother's people. "He looks like Thomas at that age," Dr. Stone observed, settling into the chair beside me with her medical bag. She'd been making regular visits, partly to check on Tommy's development and partly because our little community had become her chosen family too. "He has Thomas's kindness," I agreed, "but I see flashes of something wilder in him. The Crow blood runs strong." The ranch was thriving under the management I'd established with Samuel's help. Tommy would inherit good land, healthy cattle, and a community that would support him no matter what challenges lay ahead. But I worried about the harder inheritance he'd carry. The story of his parents, the weight of being caught between two worlds in a territory where mixed heritage could be both a strength and a burden. Running Bear visited weekly, teaching Tommy the old stories and helping me plan for the boy's cultural education. "He must know both paths," the medicine man had counseled. "The white man's way will give him prosperity, but the Crow way will give him wisdom. A man needs both to survive in the changing world." I'd been documenting everything. Thomas's story, the truth about Victoria, the community that had rallied to save an innocent child. Someday Tommy would need to understand not just what had happened, but why it mattered. He would need to know that love had triumphed over evil, that justice could bridge cultural divides, and that he came from people who fought for what was right. The territorial government was changing, bringing more structure and law to our wild country. Schools were being built, churches established, and the railroad would arrive within the decade. Tommy would grow up in a more civilized Montana than the one that had shaped his father and me. But he would also face new challenges, questions about his mixed heritage, pressure to choose sides in a world that didn't always appreciate cultural complexity. "What worries you most about raising him?" Margaret asked, following my gaze to where Tommy was now trying to lasso a patient ranch dog with a piece of rope. "That he'll grow up ashamed of either side of his heritage," I admitted. "The world is changing fast and not always in ways that honor the old wisdom. I want him to be proud of being both Crow and white, but I know there will be people who see his mixed blood as a weakness rather than a strength." As if summoned by our conversation, Tommy ran up to the porch, his face bright with 3-year-old excitement. "Grandmama," he said in his clear voice, "Running Bear says I can learn to ride the big horses soon. Will you teach me the Crow way like you taught Papa?" I gathered him into my arms, feeling the solid weight of this child who represented hope for the future. "Yes, little one, I'll teach you everything. The Crow way, the rancher's way, and most importantly, the way of love that conquers all darkness." 5 years had passed since that terrible night by the creek, and I stood once again at the same spot where I dug my grandson from his shallow grave. But this time, I wasn't alone in the darkness. I was surrounded by light, love, and the sound of an 8-year-old boy's laughter. Tommy, now calling himself Little Wolf at home and Thomas at school, was helping Running Bear place river stones in a circle around the small wooden cross we'd erected in Thomas's memory. The creek babbled peacefully beside us, no longer a place of horror but a sacred site where death had been defeated by love. "Tell me the story again, Grandmama," Tommy said, his dark eyes serious in the way children get when they sense they're part of something important. "About how Papa tried to protect me even before I was born." I knelt beside him, my old bones protesting, but my heart full. At 67, I'd lived long enough to see this child grow from a dying baby into a strong boy who moved easily between two worlds. Speaking Crow with Running Bear, learning ranch work from Samuel Hayes, and attending the new territorial school where his mixed heritage made him exotic rather than outcast. "Your father knew that love was stronger than evil," I said, the same words I'd spoken countless times. "He changed his will to protect you, and when that evil woman tried to take your life, the whole community, Crow and White together, stood up to save you." Running Bear added sweetgrass to the small fire we'd built, the sacred smoke carrying our prayers to the spirit world. Your father's spirit watches over you, little wolf, and your grandmother's courage saved not just your life, but showed our peoples that we are stronger together than apart. The old medicine man was right. Our little community had become something unique in the Montana Territory, a place where cultural differences were celebrated rather than feared, where Crow wisdom and frontier practicality worked hand in hand. Tommy was growing up bilingual, bicultural, and beloved by everyone who knew his story. "Will you tell your children about all this someday?" I asked him, watching as he carefully arranged stones in the pattern Running Bear had taught him. Tommy nodded solemnly. "I'll tell them about Papa's love and your courage and how good people fought evil together. And I'll tell them that being different isn't something to be ashamed of. It's something that makes you strong." As the sun set over the crazy mountains, painting the sky in the sacred colors my mother had taught me to honor, I felt a deep peace settle over my soul. Thomas was gone, but his son would carry forward the best of both our peoples. Victoria's evil had been defeated not just by justice, but by the love of a community that refused to let darkness win. The creek whispered its eternal song, and somewhere in that sound, I heard Thomas's voice telling me I'd done well. His son was safe, loved, and growing into the kind of man who would make both his father and his mixed heritage proud. The circle was complete. Love had conquered all. The Montana wind still carries whispers of that terrible night when evil tried to triumph over love. But as I watch my great-grandson play in the same creek where I once dug his father from a shallow grave, I know that some stories end exactly as they should, with justice served, love victorious, and the next generation stronger for the trials that came before. My journey taught me that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about acting despite the terror that threatens to paralyze you. When I found that dying baby in the cold earth, every instinct screamed to protect my son's reputation, to hide the shameful truth. But protecting evil to preserve family honor only allows darkness to spread deeper roots. True loyalty means having the strength to expose wrongdoing, even when it shatters everything you thought you knew about the people you love. The most profound lesson came from watching our divided community unite to save an innocent life. Crow warriors and white settlers stood shoulder to shoulder because a child's life mattered more than cultural differences. Running Bear's wisdom combined with Sheriff Morrison's law created justice that neither system could have achieved alone. What would you have done in my place? When family secrets threaten innocent lives, where do you draw the line between loyalty and justice? Share your thoughts below.